Okay, Matt, run the numbers for us.
Number 3 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums.
There.
Yep. Number 1 in 1972, and number 9 overall on Best Ever Albums. So this is top 10 of all time on Best Ever Albums.
Top 10 of all time.
So,
all right.
I don't know if we've done that yet. And in Rolling Stone, it's number 40. Which,
what?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can give this a top 10 biography here, guys. All right. So this is Bowie's. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said, a challenge. Go.
Ooh, go ahead. Okay. So Bowie's 5th studio album here, released on RCA Records, his first album on RCA Records. We talked a little bit about Bowie leaving his record label after his 3rd album, Man Who Sold the World, and then the lead up in the episode where we did Hunky, Dory. So if you want to check that out, feel free to dig into that bio. But this was released on June 16th, 1972. As you've probably figured out, I am about a year ahead of the other two guys on the podcast.
In terms of,
I was about to say, I come from the future a year, much like Ziggy Stardust himself. Yeah, I come from the future to tell you a little bit of what's going on. So yes, this is pretty much a full year later from both of the other albums we've covered tonight. This is also the first album that features the Spiders from Mars, which is Mick Ronson on guitar and piano, Trevor Bolder on bass and trumpet, and Mick Woodmansey, who is playing the drums. Bowie plays the acoustic guitar and the sax on this, and it's actually produced by Ken Scott, who's a CTS Hall of Famer right here. You may have known him for his work on earlier Bowie albums as well as on Beatles albums as well. And do you guys remember who was also supposed to be on this album and has an uncredited part on this album as well? He said no thank you.
Oh, the guy from Yes.
Rick Wakeman.
Wakeman,
Yep.
Yeah.
He does play on one track on this, and he was offered a spot in the Spiders from Mars on the same day he was offered a spot in Yes, and he decided to go with Yes instead. So, all right, so now a little
decision.
You think so? All right, well, I mean, it ended up working out, I think, for him.
Sliding doors.
Yeah,
what if?
Probably. And what if is right. So it ended up working out pretty well for both of them. So this album, I used the term loose, at least from a lyrical concept, very directly. It's a loose concept album in rock opera. It's based on, I am sure you guys picked up this lyrically as you guys were pouring through the lyrics, because I know both of you guys just really dig that way. It's based on a rock opera on a fictional rock star, Ziggy Stardust, who is both androgynous and bisexual, and he is sent to Earth to save it from an impending apocalyptic disaster. Now, he does save the Earth from said disaster, but then eventually devolves into all of the common tropes that a rock star would fall victim to, especially after having the inflated ego of having saved the world for everybody. A couple things to know about this is that the album was actually recorded musically before the concept was put into it, which makes a lot of sense when you hear what the album sounds like and then look at it lyrically on a number of fronts. One is very coherent and the other not so much. And sometimes stuff doesn't always match up. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There's all kinds of different theories of where Ziggy Stardust came from. David Bowie, at this time, remember, David Bowie is saying he's gay, even though he's not, to get controversy at that point, which in 1971, the whole androgynous and he may be gay thing was still very, very controversial, even within the confines of rock. And there's all kinds of people that are referenced as who this may be. Some people think that Ziggy Stardust is a melding of Lou Reed and Iggy Pop together to create the ultimate rock star in David Bowie's mind. Some people say that. Some people say it's based on a musician by the name of Vince Taylor, who was a English musician in the 60s, and he actually suffered a nervous breakdown and then came to believe he was a cross between an alien and a god, and he was sort of a well-known figure there. Some people think that's what it is.
Who among us, really?
Yeah. But Bowie says, yeah, exactly. Bowie says that the name of Ziggy Stardust came from the legendary Stardust Cowboy, although he was pretty much enraptured by Iggy Pop when he went to America to watch him, and then later produced 2 Iggy Pop comeback albums. So Iggy, kind of, it's not hard to see where that would go. Bowie, for his part, said that Ziggy was one of the few Christian names he could find with the letter Z. And then he gave all kinds of different things, to the point where I almost think he's just sort of screwing with
Oh yeah.
interviewers, because I think really at the end of the day, the hypothesis that it was a Bowie creation built on the idea of like an amalgamation of rock stars that he either became aware of and admired is probably the best guess for that. Musically, Bowie is very clear on this. The album was influenced by a lot of people, but three particularly: Lou Reed, Mark Bolan of T-Rex, and Iggy Pop. And you can definitely hear elements of all three of them in it. So it is definitely not abstract. It's not like one of those where you hear it and you go, I wonder, what would it? No, you can hear it in all of it. And the themes are the artificiality of rock music, drugs, stardom, sexual orientation, and dystopian themes, which does come out both in the sound and the lyrics of the album. Apparently, when he went in to record it, Bowie told Scott, when they're there, "You're not going to like it. It's much more like Iggy Pop than David Bowie," which I thought was interesting because he was already sort of telegraphing that along the way. A couple things we've mentioned before to know about this: 95% of the takes were on the 4 albums that Scott worked with Bowie. It's speculated by Scott were first takes of stuff. There were a couple songs on this was the one with the least amount of first takes, and what they would do is they would play the song, and then if they didn't like it, they would play it a second time, and they just play it until they liked the way it sounded. And in most of the cases, it just took 1, 2, or 3 times, and they kind of nailed it. Another thing that's interesting about this is that Bowie wrote this album at the same time that he wrote Hunky Dory. He composed both of them on piano and pretty much did them back to back with the tracks all there. He did most of Hunky Dory on the piano, as you remember, but chose to go back to the electric guitar like he did for A Man Who Sold the World for this one. And the reason he put a backing band together and actually created this album was specifically with the idea of touring with the Ziggy Stardust character. And he didn't think that Hunky Dory would be an album he could tour off of, but Ziggy Stardust was. If you remember also, Hunky Dory sold poorly, partially because the record label was told that he was creating a new persona. And, the record label wasn't necessarily wrong, because Ziggy Stardust did represent a totally different shift on there. Bowie does say that around this time when he creates the Ziggy Stardust character, it became very difficult because he was in character for so long that he almost went method actor on it and had trouble disconnecting from the personality. And I don't know how much you guys know about Bowie. We're going to get into this a lot as we go on. But throughout the 70s, he was creating personas for himself. And a big part of it was that these personas often were self-destructive. And the line between who Bowie was and these personas started to blur a little bit. And that started with Ziggy Stardust. This album had a massive tour that followed it. A concert film was made about it in July of 1973, but wasn't released until 1979. There is a rock opera with it as well. There was supposed to be a soundtrack album, but it didn't happen. Ready for this? The soundtrack album was also supposed to include the songs Gene Genie, All the Young Dudes, that went to Mott the Hoople instead, and then Rock and Roll with Me. 3 pretty well-known songs. Another interesting story about this one: Starman was not supposed to be on the album. The place for Starman was supposed to be Round and Round, which was a Chuck Berry cover that Bowie liked. The record company didn't feel there was a single, so basically Bowie just went in and wrote Starman. And it became the first track.
Wow.
So it was a tack-on add-on to this album. It was the only one pretty much that wasn't included in that batch of songs with Hunky Dory and Ziggy Stardust.
I thought Round and Round was a Rat song.
I knew you were going to say that.
We're gonna move on from that, and I'm going to continue my bio. The Ziggy Stardust character actually continues on the next album, which we'll be covering in 2 weeks, Aladdin Sane, but with a twist. So stay tuned for that. It did peak at number 5 in the UK in its time, but it only got up to number 75 in the US. It was reissued, but even then it didn't crack the top 10. But from the beginning, critics love this album, and they have never deviated from loving this album. There's a little bit of a bio. I gave a big bio on Hunky Dory. I'm going to give a big bio on Aladdin Sane. This one's a pretty big one. I think that probably if you're listening to this, if you're a completist, go into each of those and piece together the beginnings of each, and you'll get sort of a year-and-a-half sketch of what David Bowie was doing, because he was ridiculously busy during this time. Because along with doing these 3 albums and touring and creating personas, he also was producing tons of albums, including ones that you would know, like the Stooges' Raw Power, for example, he produced, and there's other ones too that are big albums that he was all over. So I mean, he and many other people speculate that part of the problems he had with drugs in the mid-70s was just sort of being overworked and, you know, trying to compensate a little bit. But yeah, so there's a little bit of the background. We haven't started with Josh yet. Josh, thoughts on the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars?
This is a monster album, and I think it's probably in my top 20 of all time albums. I haven't made that list, but listening to this album, I love every song on it. I think Mick Ronson is an underrated part of this album. The guitars are amazing on this. I'm glad it is a very loose concept album, but there's kind of like a space theme, I guess, would be the overarching thing to this. I just love all the different aspects that he puts into the song compositions. Every song has little things like, I don't know, it's just so unique. There's like horns and flutes in one part, and then like wailing guitars in another on Moon Age Daydream. You have hand claps with like almost like a guitar up, like a punk guitar riff on Hang On To Yourself, and then you've got like the pounding piano on Suffragette City. He does all of these things within the songs that you just don't hear anywhere else, and the backing band is really good, coupled with his singing. I almost think like this album doesn't get enough credit with modern listeners because it's just so unique and incredible. I don't know why I love this album so much, but it is what makes Bowie special, I think, or the first thing that made Bowie special. And I really want to check out the rock concert now. I've never seen the live performance of this album. I think that would be really enjoyable. I guess right off the bat with the 5 years too, that is with him yelling at the end 5 years over and over again with the piano and it's a little discordant, and like there's kind of like blurring of sounds or something at the end when he's yelling. It's just all very interesting, and yeah, I love it. I don't know what else to say. Hopefully I can build on things you guys say.
Gotcha. Matt, initial thoughts?
Yeah, so to me, this is light years beyond Hunky Dory. You know, the fact that this is like a 1-2 combo according to Best Ever Albums is like, this is what I want Bowie to do, right? And so, right. And this is a fantastic record. I knew most of the songs on here, even the songs I didn't really know as well. I at some point I've heard this album. You know, I never owned it, but so I was familiar with it. But I just really liked listening to it. This has got some of his best songs, or some of my favorite songs of his, including 5 Years, as Josh was mentioning. That's a great opener to this. The piano part, like the way that it builds, it's just such a simple.
It's drums one of those songs, too. Holy cow, the drums in that first track.
But it's one of those things where it's just such a simple concept, right? Like the chord progression, dun dun. He's not doing a ton, but it does build. And I'm just thinking, it shouldn't. This sounds easy, right? This is like one of those things of like watching an athlete do an amazing play that it's so effortless and they make it look easy. But like this is something that's just it's such a simple song, but it's so good, and it's a great opener to this track, and I love the way that it builds. Soul Love is like, I heard that, and now that I've heard a little bit more T-Rex, I'm like, this sounds like a T-Rex song. I mean, this totally sounds like, all right, I'm going to go do T-Rex, you know, and he does a great job of it, and makes it his own, too, because you know that Bowie kind of goes in that direction as well. But Moon Age Daydream opens with a great kind of, you know, guitar part. I'm a space age ranger, whatever. He's nuts, but it's great. Starman's, I've always loved it. You know, that's just a great single. Very catchy. Love the hand claps, as you were saying, Josh, there. And it just like Lady Stardust is a beautiful song, you know. And I could talk about each one individually. And Suffragette City's got that amazing guitar opening, like the way that guitar comes in. I love the fact that he went to the guitar here. I think it served this album very well, and maybe that would have made Hunky Dory better. I don't know. I just feel like this is Bowie really becoming the icon, right? That it's because of this album.
Yeah,
it's
like the actualized Bowie on this.
Yeah, and if Bowie was an artist that only did a couple albums or only did this, it'd be like, this is a quintessential album, I think, in the history of rock and roll. And it's almost like Ziggy Stardust, the biggest song on here, is the one that I'm kind of like, okay, because I've always loved that song, but to me that suffers a little bit from being overplayed. I hear it on the radio all the time, and it's it's something that I'm so familiar with that it lost a little bit of its luster for me. But it's such an interesting record. The musicianship's great. His passion's great. The different sounds. I mean, I'm interested to go to the other Bowie songs because, again, like I mentioned, I know most of his stuff through the singles. The albums that I had, or the one album that I had was the singles album. So, but I can't imagine it getting better than this. I mean, to me, as opposed to Joni Mitchell, this being in the top 10 of all time, I'm not sure I would put it in my top 10 of all time. But this, I understand this. This makes sense. I have no qualms with this being rated this high. I would actually say Rolling Stones got this wrong. Maybe this should be 3 and Joni Mitchell should be 40.
Yeah.
Or maybe at least this should be, top 20, I would say, on that list. So yeah, big thumbs up. Great album. This is, and I would say this, if you're going to start with Bowie, this is a great album to start with, probably not even having heard any of the other ones. Cause I don't know why this would be not a good album to start with. This seems perfect to me for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna jump in. It's a no-brainer. It's everything that it's purported to be. If you haven't heard this album, it's the one that, if you want to get why people love David Bowie, it's this. I think people have tripped over themselves overthinking stuff to try to not give this as the answer as to David Bowie's best album. And there may be other ones that are personal taste, but there is no one that this can't be one of their 2 favorite David Bowie albums. It's almost a perfect album. It's between the bookends at the beginning and 5 Years in Rock and Roll Suicide, which are almost like performance art in many ways, with just good backing musicians behind them thematically. As Matt said, Ziggy Stardust, but it's still a tremendous song.
Yeah.
Starman is a soaring song that's perfectly placed at number 4, especially with Moon Age Daydream that's in front of it, that is more dreamy, and then Starman comes in and kind of grounds it a little bit. Suffragette City is both super tight and also sloppy at times in the best way. It's like good punk music, where it's simple and aggressive and can be tight, but then they also miss chords, and there's just a rawness to it. Like Suffragette City is almost it's proto-punk. It's pre-punk, proto-punk. It's exactly what punk would sound like when played by bands that I love later, like The Clash comes to mind immediately. It's like a Clash song before there was a Clash song. So it's probably, if it isn't my favorite Bowie song, it's it's funny. My other favorite Bowie song is nothing like Suffragette City, Sound and Vision. So you couldn't pick 2 different ones, but this one from Straight Ahead Rock is almost a perfect song. I know we've said this on many things. I don't say stuff like this very often, but there's no bad songs on this album. They're good. I
agree. Yeah.
It flies by. I don't even know how long this album is, but it feels like it somehow goes by in 15 minutes, but also doesn't end too soon. I don't know how to, that's another, the tracks are perfectly synced up. Yes, the lyrics. See, every one of the songs is very interesting as a standalone song, but when you put them together as like a rock opera, it doesn't hold up as much. But the songs themselves are very interesting songs. It's just the concept part of it falls off a little bit. But I like the lyricism on it. It's classic Bowie, that it's got the space elements, it's got the androgyny, the perils of fame. For whatever reason, there's a lot of, at the end of there's a cinematic element to Bowie that it seems like his heroes it doesn't end well for them. You know, a lot of, whether it be Space Oddity or The Man Who Sold the World or Ziggy Stardust in this case, all the way to when he's doing The Thin White Duke later. It's just there's a tragic element.
Yeah, even in his he did this movie called The Man Who Fell to Earth directed by Nicholas Roeg, and it's about a Martian he plays a Martian who's supposed to go to Earth to bring back water, but he gets stuck with living like the Earth lifestyle and like becomes famous or gluttonous and like all the consumerist and just ends up not going back to Mars and like becoming this drugged out like famous Martian and like destroying himself. It's very similar to when you describe the concept of Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah, well, it's a constant theme. I'll have to look into why Bowie seems to be so drawn to space, because that is something that comes up quite a bit. I don't want to say it's a science fiction outlook, because it's very specific to a dystopian space environment. But he's, then you blend that with this androgynous worldview, which Mark Bolan was doing as well during this period, and you can see very much both sonically and thematically how he was influenced. But yeah, this is an album that I'm even listening now, you can tell it was ahead of its time. When we listen to everything else from the late 60s, early 70s, and even around the same time, there's very few people doing what he's doing here. Glam rock is probably actually exactly who we talked about. The Velvet Underground, glam rock, and the Stooges are also people that sound like they came from another planet. And that's kind of where Bowie was, and he was running in those same circles.
Put them in a blender, and there you go.
And that's probably why I like this. I like Bowie and this album so much. It's like I love those three things, and like the combination of them is just incredible.
Yeah, he took three things you love, Josh, and he blended them together into a picture with a little bit of science fiction, which you're partial to, and rockin' guitars that he brought back from Maze of the World.
I love dystopias. The current dystopia we're living in. I love it.
So you said, why do I not get it? Now you do, Josh. There you go. We've talked through it. Yep.
Well, the thing is, too, he does all those things, but then he takes them all together and he makes them quintessentially his,
and accessible too. This is like a supremely easy album. He makes it weird, but also easy to listen to.
It's high concept art for music, but that you can consume as a plebeian, which is ridiculously hard. It's what Andy Warhol tried to do for years, and I would argue Bowie was like, here's how you actually do it.
Well, because the thing is, again, at the core of all of these songs, you strip it all down, it's just it's catchy, melodic. It builds like some of these songs are building, and it's just the structure of it is just a quintessentially great music. And so, but then you pepper all of that with all of that stuff you're talking about, all those influences and the story and all that, and you get this work that's just. Yeah, it's just great, and it never gets old. Even with Ziggy Stardust, hearing it over and over again, it is still a great song, And I actually also read that somebody said that that's one of the first power ballads, and I was like, I've never considered that a power ballad, I thought that was kind of an interesting take on that, but
why do people have to?
I don't know.
That, know. It's Ziggy Stardust. It doesn't have to be a power ballad that gets compared to like Night Ranger. It doesn't have to go there. That's people with too much time on their hands.
I also can't imagine that somebody heard that was like, oh, this is the way we need to take music to do a Night Ranger, like a power ballad type song. So I don't know, but I'm just saying that like I know that that's a song that I was kind of like, well, it is overplayed, but it's still really good. That's just that's one of the first. That might have been one of the first Bowie songs that I heard that I was like, ooh. That's cool, and there's a reason why it's played all the time and why people love it. So, just so good, so good.
Well, we haven't even mentioned. I mean, the sax parts that Bowie does are awesome on this album.
I didn't even know he played the sax. Of course, I'm not surprised by it, but
there's great piano and trumpet on this album. There's the drummer Woodsmansey is fascinating because every once in a while he surfaces in 5 years and you're like, whoa, that's some good drumming. And then he goes back and can immediately go atmospheric, which is a skill in its own right. The guitar parts by Mick Ronson, as they were on Man Who Sold the World. Josh, you went back and listened, right? And I know you didn't love the album, but the guitar was there on that one. Mm-hmm. And Bowie didn't love Mick Ronson's playing on that album, and he kind of left him alone more here, and that was a good artistic decision because the guitar through line of this is fantastic. I mean, multiple songs. The easy one to point out on is in Suffragette City because it's just this crunchy guitar part solo at the beginning that's awesome, but it's all over the place. It's the musicianship here is another thing that adds to. Bowie kind of, I think, knew he needed a band to fully realize this sound and this performance he wanted, and like as a tastemaker and as a sonic, someone who hears the pieces come together, you could tell he produces albums, right? Because sonically this album is fantastic, and the bits and pieces, he knows exactly the right amount of instruments to put in a track, no more, no less, and that's so that it's not overstuffed, but it's also complex enough that there's layers to it. It's really masterful. It really, I mean, you can read superlative after superlative. I only scratched the surface on this, but the musicianship, the package, the Bowie as a stage performer, I posted on the Twitter account, the performance of Starman on Top of the Pops when he's got the shock orange hair and sort of like he's pale and he's got the bodysuit kind of. It's exactly what you think of with Ziggy Stardust. It's and you can see why it's a Star Maker performance. It's fantastic. Yeah.
I got to give a shout out to the piano in Suffragette City too, because that's a great like the banging. It's like a Jerry Lee Lewis kind of thing where you're just kind of rocking that out, and that's really well done too. So
there's rockabilly on this album too. Is it Hang On to Yourself? Is that the one that has the rockabilly? I think in it. There's all kinds of little tweaks that you hear other sonic, which makes sense because Bowie has a music theory background. So
Well, even like, I guess he does all these little things in the songs. Like at the end of Suffragette City, you're already like, okay, that was an awesome song. But then he like carries it off and he ends with like wham bam. He goes,
goes
wham
back into
bam,
it
thank you, man.
Yeah.
Which is glam, which is basically the Sweet and T-Rex, the glam rock bands that were famous at the time. Yeah,
and then he brings it back.
Yeah, and he just like ends with the more like guitar part or whatever, however he ended it. But it's he didn't have to do that to make it a great song, but he just like elevates it even more.
But you're glad he did do it though, right? You're like, I want some more. That's right. Yeah, do it. Yeah.
Well, and that's why he was ahead of the curve all the way up to the early 80s. He kind of he lost his fastball a little bit, realized he lost his fastball, and kind of, he did the noise rock in the late 80s and didn't really fit there, and then kind of was able to reinvent himself in the 90s with the electronic music, when he was doing industrial music, I should say, then kind of fell away and then ended his career with the Black Star and the later Bowie stuff. So, I mean, there were times when he kind of lost the he's very much like Madonna in that you could just see he saw things for years and years way ahead of everybody else, and it never was artificial for a long time because he had it almost felt like he was being talked to by the future, and he saw everything a couple months or a year before everybody else did, or knew exactly when to jump on the zeitgeist. Yeah.
Well, and then people followed, right? And then he changed. He changed, fashion. He changed music. He changed, images and stuff. So yeah.
And he was able to do what like Mark Bolan was doing, but add another twist so it didn't seem too derivative.
Yep.
Because this is glam rock for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and he also, I mean, probably, I don't know a ton of other but that's kind of what the lane that T-Rex stayed in, and he just he did other stuff. He didn't just keep doing the same thing,
Well, it's the lane they stayed in for that 3 or 4 year period when they were biggest, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. And then they had a career before and a career after, but yeah.
Yeah, but this album is more complex than the T-Rex.
Yes. Yeah, he goes in more directions than the T-Rex stuff for sure. So, strongest recommend possible. I'd be shocked if this doesn't end up in my top 10 albums for the 70s. I know there's a lot of ones I love, so I don't want to.
It's going to be hard to
say immediately, but there's. Let's put it this way: if it doesn't end up in the top 10, it's not because it's not a phenomenal album. It's just because there's some other really freaking fantastic albums.
What did this get on your scoring? If
This is a 59 out of 60, and it's tied. It's the only one ahead of it right now is Exile. It's 60 of 60. I think the Derek and the Dominoes album has a 58 out of 60, so that one's high up there too. Sticky Fingers is a 58.5 out of 60, so that's kind of the rarefied air, right? Those four right there. There's actually a remarkable amount of albums though that are 54 or above, and I'm a pretty tough grader, but there's been some great, and we're not even in the late 70s, which is probably one of my 2 or 3 favorite periods of music. So there's going to be albums that hit high on that, and we're already
Yeah, this is going to be impossible to pick a top 10, I think, for me.
That's why you got to rank real time, man, because then you can kind of see. So that's why I do it. Yeah.
This is essential. This is this is a Hall of Fame album.
Yeah. It's the definition of essential. Yeah. And you can like rock, you can like pop, you can like everything. You know what I mean? You can get to this from however you want to get to it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an album, like, if you didn't like this album, I would just probably, like, slap you in the face and walk away.
Yeah, Josh would get violent on you.
Well, it would be more of a, like, I'd ask you, like, well, what do you like? Because this seems like a pretty safe bet,
And then that person would say, I like everything.
Yes.
I listen to everything, John.
Except David.
End scene. Run out. If you haven't heard this, I mean, go listen to it now. Stop this podcast and go listen to it now and then come back. And when you come back,